Chapter 12. The so-called Orphic and Pythagorean spiritual revolution consists in a reversion of the traditional Greek view, namely that psyche is a simulacrum or eidolon of the mortal body. The Orphic and pro-Egyptian Dionysical Osirian esotericism now regards the living body as an illusory and transitory, albeit complex and complicated, image of the immortal soul, whose purification may be described as separation from the body, soma, corpse, by recollection and amnesis. Asceticism, turning away from the flux of becoming, ta genomena, and from its unreliable images, and philosophical contemplation, theoria, of intelligible principles. In short, the prospect of personal immortality in the Egyptian fashion and promotion of scientific knowledge, episteme, as the chief soteriological power are inseparable from their initial Orphico-Pythagorean context. Though, quote, the idea of proof is introduced as a rhetorical device, end proof, end quote, not related with theoria as a spectacle of the divine epiphany, science and logic can claim to constitute the salvation of its practitioners only when based on the premise of the mathematical nature of the demiurge world construction. The quote-unquote scientific soteriology of Plato, itself based on the Pythagorean and sophistic episteme, is a domain of a small elite group whose central reflections and ironic speculations in relation to the central body of political orthodoxy and the sophistic style of education are regarded as an almost gnosis-like means of dialectical salvation. Yehuda Elkanah explains, quoting from The Emergence of Second-Order Thinking in Classical Greece, in The Origins and Diversity of Axial Age Civilizations, in 1986, page 61. For instance, the road to the Pythagorean heaven leads through the well-defined corpus of the geometrical proof. This is the Pythagorean soteriology. The carriers of the transcendental vision are small groups of intellectuals, often marginal to society, who contemplate the alternative views of the world. The moment when the logos, which is not bestowed upon every person in the same degree, is becoming the main source of knowledge, then the source of knowledge becomes elitist and authoritarian by nature. Consequently, it is not surprising that the fields that were built upon the Parmenidean method, that is by strict deductions, namely mathematics and theoretical physics, became strictly authoritarian, and their practitioners began to organize themselves into exclusive groups like the Academy, the Lyceum, and some monastic orders. All these are characterized by equality among the members and authoritarian separatism towards the outside world. End quote. Since the Homeric values of body life and shadow or simulacrum-like soul are radically inverted by their esoteric opponents, what survives now is the soul understood as a manifestation, Ba in the Egyptian Ramesside theology, of the divine spirit, be it called daemon or theos. The soul is the winged Ba, the breath and living image of Amun, alone is from the gods. Therefore, quote, what survives is an image of life, eidolon ionos, which sleeps during normal bodily consciousness, but wakes up while the body sleeps and foresees future events in prophetic dreams. End quote. The soul is a sort of fallen daemon, or as a Dionysian divine spark, is buried in a tomb-like material body, thus entering the cosmic cycle of elemental transformation. Hence the soul is the pre-existing and immortal knowing subject. It passes through a number of incarnations in a cyclical pattern, and these bodily incarnations may be regarded as a sort of punishment, ordeal, or simply viewed as a result of forgetfulness, ignorance, and play. Therefore, the ultimate aim of the soul is freedom from the wheel of terrestrial punishment, following the soteriological formula bios, thanatos, bios, or life, death, life, which shows the way of entering the eternal and noetic quote-unquote day of Ra or Helios. This freedom implies the restoration of one's initial divine identity. The deliverance, lusus, is performed by Dionysus Bakchios through specific cathartic rituals, and Persephone must decide whether those purified souls that have paid the penalty for their wrongful deeds may be sent to the seats of the blessed, Hedrus Eis, Oi Hegion. The soul's ultimate goal in its final liberation from the painful cycle of reincarnation, thus arriving, quote, at the victor's crown with swift feet, end quote, and ending as God instead of mortal. As Bartel Portman observes, it is the Orphico-Pythagorean tradition that Socrates has in mind when he introduces the theory of recollection, anamnesis, experienced by certain divinely inspired seers and poets, and based on the clear separation of the immortal soul and mortal body. Quoting, "Death and immortality in Greek philosophy from the pre-Socratics to the Hellenistic era. In Hidden Futures, Death and Immortality in Ancient Egypt, Anatolia, the Classical, Biblical and Arabic Islamic World," 1994, pages 209 to 10. This ontological dualism goes hand in hand with epistemological dualism. There are two different states of knowing, having the forms for its objects. Suke's state is episteme, having the eis theta for its objects. The sense's state of knowing is doxa. The fact of having the forms as objects of knowledge implies that Suke is immortal. This is in line with the principles known from the pre-Socratic theory of knowledge, similia similibus cognoscuntur. The forms are imperishable, therefore the subject knowing them must be imperishable. End quote. The subject contemplates the forms like the temple prophetes contemplates the animated hieratic statues of the Egyptian gods. His own eye, Iret, is awakened to light and related to the active aspect, Idu, that which acts, of the visible manifestation of the deity through the shining light. So the ability of the cult statue, the Tut of Amun, for example, to act, Iri, is a response to the ritual action, equated with the eye of Horus and performed by the priest. The cobra-like Ureos of the animated statue is identified with the solar eye of the divine self-consciousness, and with Ma'at, truth, right, proportion, and justice. Even the officiant refers to himself as a Ba and as the goddess Sekhmet, at the point when he is ready to embrace the statue. The Platonic subject imagines the vision of these forms by himself when he is unrestricted by a mortal body, that is either after physical death or whilst living in the body, and separation is accomplished by the Osirian initiation, or by a kind of philosophical contemplation, theoria. This telistic or dialectical separation is regarded as essentially an intellective, noetic passage. It is like one's entering the solar bark of Ra, based on the ontological and epistemological premise that embodied cognition mirrors disembodied cognition, or rather divine intellection. Consequently, only when separated from our mortal bodies and elevated to the stars, the Hanatic archetypes, do we regain our true divine identity, our real being and Gnostic immortality, being in an ideal cognitional, or rather contemplative state of knowledge, episteme. Since the ideal Platonic knower is the disembodied soul, analogous to the Egyptian Ba turned into a noetic Ach, Plato's Socrates elaborates on eschatological Orphic myth of the blessed afterlife, after separation of body and soul, and the identification of the person with the latter, for it is the state of the latter that is judged by the gods. Therefore, Lloyd Gerson argues, quote, For Plato, embodied persons are the only sorts of images that can reflexively recognize their own relatively inferior states as images and strive to transform themselves into their own ideal. End quote. That quote from Lloyd P. Gearson's Knowing Persons, A Study in Plato, page 26. Hence, philosophers quote-unquote long to die and strive to transform themselves into the aku, the noetic spirits of light that participate in the sun god's resurrection and share, quote, the triumph of Ra, end quote. They stipulate this metaphorical and literal, quote-unquote, separation by means of a certain epistemological initiation, since the philosopher's soul attains truth by reasoning.